universal basic income. So I think I think you wrote a Medium article on this at one point, didn't you, or something similar? I read several Medium articles on
Yeah,
UBI. I can't remember which one it was.
I did write something related to universal basic income. It was because it's a part of futurism that is necessary to cover.
Mm,
Because if you want to improve the world in some way, I think this is the or a version of this. Of course, it can be
mm,
implemented in various different ways. A version of this is kind of a thing that's necessary to do eventually
mm.
to really address some of the like inequalities or these sort of problems that are created just because many people are often almost artificially kept in poverty so that they don't actually have the time and the ability to even start considering world problems because they have their own problems that they have to address. So for some
Right.
time it was like the debate was how to reform or do specifically welfare or what kind of welfare and or how to means test it and all these kinds of questions. But eventually it sort of became obvious that maybe this whole means tested welfare thing is still problematic because it doesn't actually solve the problem that you want it to solve by
Yeah.
giving people means to lead life the way they want it. And that is because if you make it means tested, then you sort of create the bureaucracy around it and force people to just like pointlessly run around between different government offices and
Yeah.
just do oftentimes something that may even be like or feel like more work than if they were actually
Yeah.
working. So they don't have money, but they also therefore don't have time. And like the free, so it's like you just it's another way how like in this universe sometimes it feels like almost like a law of nature that like to those who have a lot more is given all the time, and to those who don't have anything like even more is taken away from them, like by sort of like a cosmic inertia, like that something has to be done to stop this or like by itself it just that's how just it will work. So you
Yeah.
oftentimes if you do this kind of sort of welfare, you take away time from them, still don't give them enough means anyway in many cases. And
Yeah.
because like countries like for instance United States are especially frustrating because in the European Union, like there are people who hate European Union and there are problems with this like its appointed nature, like I mentioned in one of our previous talks. So there are some issues with it to be had by Democrats or people who are freedom minded. However, in European Union, oftentimes the governmental institutions on the European level are actually doing things the way the government was like intended to function mostly, so that you do environmental protections and you do make sure that like health medicines and healthcare are provided properly, and so that you do provide the service, and there are no pressures within the system to exclude people away from it. Like if somebody has issues with how it's done in European Union, it's generally the issue is like it's given too much to too many people, so that the immigrants are then coming into Europe just to get those and yada yada. There's like this sort of
Yeah.
problem. So it's a very different problem than in the United States, where it's not even working as it was supposed to because there are intense pressures from various political parties, or I guess one party, but political groups, let's say, that are sort of allied under that
Yeah.
party. And I'm not going to say which one, or that is necessarily just a single one, but there's some party
Yeah.
definitely in the United States which wants to exclude people from those services and ruin those services so that people don't get them, and so that people then therefore blame the government anyway for it and support further removal of those services. So it's not even like if you wanted to criticize like how it's specifically happening in the United States, it's not so much just criticism of like problems of government welfare. It's like a whole like another level of problems
Mm.
that's tangled with it. So that's just completely just confused mess on purpose largely. So if you want to criticize or objectively, let's say, evaluate like the downsides or the inefficiencies or problems with the whole concept of government welfare, then you need to look at parts of the world or countries which are actually trying to do it to the best of its potential, and then it still has problems, obviously. So then
Yeah.
you have to compare that with the potential for something like universal basic income that's not means dependent, and
Yeah.
how different it would be for better or for worse.
I think that's the thing I like the most about the UBI is it just generally speaking is easier to understand. It's just kind of simple, very, very basic. Everybody gets a flat amount whether you work or not. There's no way to really game the system because everybody's getting it. You can't. The biggest problem I always had with welfare, and I think most people have this issue with welfare, is when people get it and don't really need it, or they're getting it and then they choose not to work because as soon as they work, their welfare gets clawed back, and they might make just as much on welfare as if they were working a full-time job. So there's zero incentive to go out and do anything. And I absolutely hated that. It's kind of like that in Canada to some extent. They claw back at least 50%. I mean, for me, for example, even with the child tax credits, you have child tax credits in Canada that are very generous. They're $500-600 per child, but they claw back 20-30% of it once you get over 30 grand income, and then that's on top of your 40 to 50% tax bracket. So once you get over between 30,000 and 100,000 income, you're basically in a 70% clawback bracket. So it's like you're not paying any tax on the first 30,000, and then all of a sudden you're only making $3 out of every 10 that you earn. So it's kind of a real disincentive to kind of go above and beyond and work overtime at all. Like every hour of overtime you work, you're only making $3 out of the 10 that you're earning. So it's a strong disincentive to ever go above and beyond and try to find a more higher paying job or whatever.
Yeah,
It's like,
I think you've identified the number one most irrational aspect of how welfare is generally conditioned, and exactly for the reason that you described, which is also, in my opinion, it's also the same in the Czech Republic and most places where welfare is set up as like when you don't actually have income, then you are like allowed to get it, which creates the situation where, like you said, many people like might even have less money than people who don't work at all. Like people who work might end up having less money than people who can get that welfare that don't work, and that's socially divisive,
exactly.
where
Yeah.
it's then creating the resentment between like the working people and the non-working people. And sometimes, or in some countries, I guess for sure, but like sometimes it almost seems like intentional, that like this is supposed to be intentional to create division in society. So whether intentional or not, that's a major flaw of the whole welfare system, the like general formula, which is solved by universal basic income. Even if it wasn't anything special or spectacular, it's just a flat rate of money, and just by
Yeah.
the fact that you don't get it taken away, or that you like still qualify when you have a job.
Yep.
So then you're always motivated to have additional job because you're just getting that amount of money anyway for the basic part. So yeah, I think like that element alone is a major fix for the whole concept of welfare, what welfare was getting wrong.
I agree, and that's definitely the main reason I love the UBI. So if you start to think of other ways, just going back to the basics on tiered tax levels, right? So you start to think the more money you have, the more you should be paying to help society. It's kind of a little bit of a valid argument because the millionaires and billionaires out there who are running the businesses, they're taking advantage of all the commons essentially, or all the infrastructure that's set up by governments and by all of us essentially. We're all part of their customer base. We're all supporting them and giving them, the chances to make millions or billions of dollars by being there for them and helping them. So it just kind of makes sense that they would pay a little bit more. But when you raise it too much and you make that incentive disappear too much, then there's definitely a disincentive for doctors and lawyers and businessmen to really go above and beyond and keep working harder to make more if they're being clawed back at a higher rate. So there's got to be a happy medium or balance there somewhere. And personally, I think one potential solution would be to remove income tax altogether and start doing things like taxing pollution, taxing resource use, consumption, just on a general level. The only argument against doing that people have is that that's kind of a tax on the poor, because they have to consume just as much and they're paying tax, so it's not tiered anymore. But of course, the perfect counter argument for that is, again, well, if you've got the UBI flattening it out, then they're basically balancing out whatever tax they would have paid, so they're getting back more than the small amount of consumption they're doing. So it's not tax on the poor anymore. So those are kind of the two major arguments for kind of really pushing in this direction, just making it fair for everybody. You can't really complain. If you really understand what a UBI is and how it works, it's really hard to complain about it. It's really hard to say, oh, but that's not fair. It absolutely is for everybody. Everybody's getting that base.
No, I agree that like the problem is solved, like the problem of the value. I think it's value added tax, isn't it? This is the kind of
Yeah,
tax that you were talking about, or a
yeah,
part of the kinds of tax that you were talking about.
yeah. Like a value-added tax is like in Canada it's called a harmonized sales tax (HST), and it basically is just a little bit of tax on everything up to I think 13% is the general. There's a provincial portion to it and a federal portion to it, but they put it
When
all
you say
together.
tax on consumption, that
Yeah,
is would be disproportionately affecting the poorer people as opposed to the richer people. It's like I'm just trying to put it in the context of what I've learned or where I've heard that argument, because I think the argument that you've described I've heard in the context of value added tax
that's correct. Yeah,
as a
that's
solution.
exactly what I'm talking about. If you have the value added tax, it doesn't matter whether you tax it like when you create the product or if you tax it when you sell the product. It really doesn't matter. You could do it at either place. But the bottom line is that product is going to get more expensive because there's a tax on it. So even if, like in Canada, we don't tax basic necessities like food. And I think that's good in general. You shouldn't, like things that everybody obviously has to buy to survive, you shouldn't really have any value added tax on that in general. But things like junk food, things like sugary or unhealthy foods, those have tax. So I think kind of Canada, for one, is doing well with that. Maybe you could even have more value-added tax on certain things. We have more taxes on things like alcohol and tobacco, and I think that for good reason, because those things obviously cost more for our free healthcare system. So people who eat unhealthy things or do unhealthy things, it's gonna cost more to make them better, so that they have to kind of pay a higher price, and it just goes back to paying for their healthcare later on.
Yeah, just to play a little devil's advocate here, from like, because this is kind of thing that's often debated in debating competitions, because it's one of those things where there's a lot to debate in the particulars of any tax plans, and one of those things is like with the like there's always will have to be somebody who's like determining, some government body that's determining like what are the vices and the things that are bad and good. Like I think like that's one of the areas where you could apply the sort of scientific utilitarianism. You kind of sort of can say which things are healthy or unhealthy, and you can definitely quantify how much, like you said, the healthcare costs that the regular consumption of those things incurs. And I think that's a fairly objective argument. I just think like ultimately, like those details or specifics are not gonna like make or break the system. And I think like people are entitled to have opinions about these details. I think like what's most important for it to work are that the universal basic income would be given to everybody unconditionally. That changing that would make or break if the system works. And as for the taxes, like you said, whether there is progressive tax or to what extent, or if it's all a kind of value-added tax, or like you said, the pollution tax. I think like the most important aspect of that for the whole system to work into the future, both environmentally and economically, is the kind of the pollution tax. Like you have to have, like we discussed before, you have to use externalities be included in the calculations. I think that's the like most important tax that will make or break again the system and or economy and or environment. As for like progressive tax or to what extent, I think the main issue that people who are like regular working people who pay taxes have with billionaires is that oftentimes they don't pay anything in taxes. Like if it was at least just the same as everybody else, that already, but actually meaning that like it would be whatever they really made would, that the like 20 or 30% or whatever it's the normal rate of that would be taxed. I think most people ultimately would be fine. It's the fact that oftentimes, especially the billionaires, would be like not paying in effect any tax. And I think there was like who was it, Warren Buffett, like one of them was even pretty much complaining about it, like saying like, yeah, I don't think that's great that it is possible that I can pay less taxes than like the cleaning lady or something to that effect. So that would be great start. Like great start would be at least actual equality, because that would be pretty hard to argue against. I have like this whole issue, like of course the arguments again to show the debating perspective, or how a debater would debate it in a debating competition. So it's like theoretically break it down and explain what the issues might be. So with progressive tax, the issue, like one of the arguments why it should be a thing, is that the objective line that sort of changes person's status is whether they have all the money they need to survive and like thrive, but basically to have enough food and shelter and all of those things. And once you like go over, especially by orders of magnitude, you go over that limit, then more money for you means more yachts. And more yachts is not like a defensible concern that especially when there's this whole other kind of argument that's very egalitarian argument, is that okay, so you have a company and somebody has to be the CEO, and that's a job, sure, but all of those other jobs are equally essential to the whole thing functioning. You still need to have, like, your business is some sort of like a manufacturing business where there's like a hard work involved, then of course the hard work of the people who are doing the hard work is the essential element of the whole enterprise functioning. So there are, and I think the model for that economically is co-ops. And I think, what's his name? Wolf, I think, is a fairly known socialist thinker. I forgot his first name. I think his last name is Wolf. And he's doing a lot of appearances in not very pro-government news sources and more alternative news and more sort of over the internet. He makes lectures and stuff. And sort of the sort of socialist solution, I think the most reasonable socialist contribution to the debate of what you should economically do, how we should transform society, is that like maybe companies should be more co-ops, meaning that it's more normal, then becomes more normal that everybody in the company has more equalized pay. Because there are examples of like co-ops that are completely functional, where it could be like a bakery business, or I think one is like a robotics business. There are a few well-known examples. I think maybe in Spain, in some European countries, become pretty big. Like there's like a very big co-op, and I was like more normal than other places. Again, for specifics, I think some of the Wolf's lectures about it, like would be specific examples. And it's definitely a viable model. Like there are examples of this that function, where they basically decided that it's collectively owned company, so there's nobody who's owning the whole thing and people just work there. That's what the basic of in principle of what a co-op is like. It's cooperative or even cooperatively owned, so and governed, and the profits are distributed that way. So that's a sort of a model that's inherently way more fair or egalitarian. And if more workplaces were like this, then they would also be, because that's a democratic workplace, where if everybody has pretty much equal share in the company or gets the same amount of money, so if the decision is made, then it won't be just a few people on the top making the decision to enrich themselves. It will be for sure for the benefit of the whole working collective. The counter argument against co-ops as a kind of thing that works, like for example, from Urza, from anarchists or people who are more on the left, but a different kind of left than socialists, would be that it's still problematic in that it can succumb to like a charismatic leader type thing. So yeah, technically it's egalitarian, but it still can be authoritarian in environments. So there are other ways to organize work that might be less prone to some sort of a traditional sort of socialist charismatic leader taking over and then turning it into something that's much darker. But in general, like what I'm just trying to demonstrate is that there's one thing to argue for like a extreme progressive tax on the rich. And I guess the argument for that would be like against that would be like the whole trickle down economics, which is pretty much ruled out as that's not really how that works. It doesn't really rain down back again. So it doesn't really have super justification to just let them keep all of the money way much more than any other individual on planet Earth has. But at the same time, I think it should be completely reasonable to argue for more equality, meaning that at least they should pay the taxes like everybody else, at least normally. And that it should become more normal that working environments in companies or cultures in companies should become more equal, meaning that there's not such a huge disparity between a manager and all the other employees.
Yeah, I really like I like free market capitalism for the part where it's supply and demand, where it's, you know, if someone's studying a lot more or getting a lot better at something, doctors and lawyers, for example, you want them to be paid at least a little more than the average person who doesn't have that much education or hasn't put the extra work in to become successful and skilled at whatever it is they're skilled at. But it's got to be kind of a fair, you know, supply and demand curve where you're not artificially limiting the number of doctors or lawyers based on how many people you let into the school. So it makes it so you're always constantly trying to get more doctors, even though you might have hundreds or thousands of people that could be very good qualified doctors if you allowed them into the schools to be trained. And so it would kind of be a much fairer distribution if you just didn't have the limits on the education the same. And another similar thing is teachers. Teachers are very much limited positions in Canada, and they're paid extremely well. 6-figure salaries here in Canada, and in the States they're not nearly paid as well, which I think is good. But at the same time, everybody wants to be a teacher, but because there's so many and because it's paid so well, people who really want to be teachers can't get teacher jobs. Because it's such a high demand, profession because they're paid so well. So it'd be like, you just want to make sure that people who really want to do it and be passionate about it are able to get in, and they're not blocked out by people just because you're artificially limiting the number of positions, right?
I have to sort of react now because I have like 15 responses, because you've touched on so many problems. One of them, like the first one, is that what I was talking about, what the people about, like that you should have more equal pay between managers and everybody else in companies. What that's about is not that you don't want to reward skill, like. Of course, if you have a free market still in the future that just has more co-ops, it would still likely result in rewarding more people who have invested more time into education or have rarer, more lucrative skills, because like fewer people are even capable of it, and that drives up the wage. And how much money can they, by their contribution, make or help make people in the company, like the sort of modifier on how much they increase the profits of like when you hire them. That should be all taken into account, and that again people would understand that as fair. What the problem would be is downplaying the value of manual labor. Is like what very much has been a trend for the last several decades, was that these jobs were, especially if it's managed by like the single billionaire who owns the whole thing and only cares about min-maxing profits, then it's like super driven to be the lowest possible, to such an extent that if anybody in the whole world would offer even less, and there would always be somebody in a non-democratic country who would offer less because the country would force the people to work in worse conditions. So they would even like say like F you, like America or Canada, I'm gonna go with these jobs to, I don't know, China or Saudi Arabia or somewhere where like it can really squeeze the workers. So I think the issue that people on the left have with the way the corporations or jobs, especially manual jobs, work now in places or at places like Amazon. And which is interesting. There's actually been is going to be a huge Amazon center constructed right next to where I live. Which will give like jobs to the whole region, meaning like 6 districts or something, which is like pretty huge for the Czech Republic. So I'm pretty sure the value of this house that I'm right in is now skyrocketing. So if I wanted to like make money, they would just like build a house on the piece of land that we have and then just like rent it to somebody. So I can like, actually I'm interestingly in a position to be able to profit from it as a person who's educated and already has some money or ability to borrow money. And so like I could actually make bank on this thing. I don't want to. But at the same time, it's sort of this interesting interplay of these situations. It's like, it's good, even for manual workers, in that Amazon will actually pay more than is currently normally in the region. So I completely understand the argument. Is like, but still good can be good in some way for the region, because like for my region specifically, in my district especially, there's not much like skilled labor even available in the region. So if there is a job, it will probably be unskilled manual job. And if like under current circumstances, well, currently it's already improving because of course now they have to be raising the wages of the sort of scumbag employers in the area because they're afraid now of the competition. So it's sort of like a free market sort of working to help. But still, I'm pretty sure that the jobs at Amazon will be terrible because it's Amazon and the conditions aren't great. It could be an improvement, which still be terrible probably. From my point of view, there's like one element that's important to consider is like, yes, pay skilled people more. That's never going to be any different. In any society, you don't want sort of like communist like total equality where nobody can make more money for anything, that's very demotivating and not good for the society, because it doesn't get very many skilled people into the right position. So that would be terrible. So that's like one whole issue, is what I was just trying to say, is like whatever the solution would be that would be sustainable has to be to some extent more egalitarian in terms of like paying people for work than the current global normal is. So that's one issue. Another issue with teachers, when you said that like in Canada that they're well paid and not that many like positions, is very different from, I guess, most places in the world. What the problem is, I think the general problem is that they are very overworked and underpaid, in addition to the system being a bureaucratic Kafkaesque nightmare in most places, which is why me, a person who's definitely most suited to be a teacher, deciding that I under no circumstances can tolerate being a teacher in the education system as it exists, for all of the reasons, because I don't have to I don't want to go somewhere where I would be underappreciated, undervalued, oppressed, and forced to still not be able to do my job effectively. So it's just basically everything's like a check boxes, like everything's wrong. So in general, like with places like teachers, I think something like the alternative world education system is actually part of the solutions, like, because all these things are interconnected, like universal basic income, education reform towards free open education system, something like the bank that you proposed, like with this whole world credit thing, pollution taxes, all of these things, I think like only in concert like it can actually help. Because with the teachers, like what you would need is more free market, in that you would sort of destroy the monopoly or supremacy of the current extremely constrictive system, and then when it would be actual free market deciding, then it would be like the amount of teachers in any society or country would just be then legitimately determined by what the demand is. So it would probably be like more people being able to do those kinds of jobs, because people would also diversify their education, in that it would be many different lecturers hired probably for any particular person, dabbling in entirely different kinds of education, much more like probably diversified. So in that sense, I think that's a solution to that. And I definitely forgot the next thing that you were talking about, and I had a response to that as well.
Let me make the one point, because I really like the point you made about the manual jobs. So just talk a little bit about manual jobs and how UBI kind of really fixes this, I think, extremely well. Because if there is a flat level UBI and you just don't necessarily have to do the crap manual jobs, then the only people that are going to do it are the ones that are either kind of enjoy it, or they're paid well enough to actually get someone to do it. No one's ever kind of slave labor forced into any job they don't like. So whether it's, a garbage sewage job or just any kind of crappy job in the world, in order to get anyone to do it, you're going to have to pay more. But ideally, what you really want in the perfect world, of course, in the future, is if you do that well and it makes it so that you can't afford to pay the labor, then you find a way to automate it or do it better with robotics. And in the long term, that's really what we want to do with all these kind of manual jobs, is just not do them anymore. Humankind shouldn't have to do those jobs. If you can't pay someone enough to do it without forcing them, or having a whip kind of behind there, or a hunger as a forcing them to do it, and you can't hire a robot to do it, then it's just not worth doing, really.
Yeah, automation is another. Yeah, automation is another potential can of worms and or a solution to all of our problems. Because again, automation would be probably, or is already, it's a thing, is already problematic now because of what the system is now. Because it's automation completely owned by like a single billionaire somewhere, and therefore it's just eliminating jobs for people in a system where they then are left screwed. Because if they don't have a job, they have to have one. So because the current way of thinking is you have to make a situation so that like people have to have jobs, so that you force them into doing all the things that need to be done. So sort of not the carrot but the stick approach is very much the dominant approach now. And of course, in a UBI world, that's solved in that you switch from stick to carrot, and that turns the incentive in the right direction, which is to create better working environments. Because again, I can see it in my region recently what it's doing with the worst jobs in my region when suddenly something better is turning up, which is very similar to what it would be in a UBI world, because like the something better would just be a different kind of thing that's better, but it's something that now creates a situation in which people suddenly realized that they don't have to need that particular job, so they that they know that they can do better or can have an option or possibility of finding something better. So that is forcing even the worst scumbag employers, of which there are many in my region. And I know it might sound like I'm biased against, but you don't know what specifically they are like. Like, I can give you examples. Like one of them is collecting tanks. It's not yachts, it's tanks. It's like, I guess, the more socialist version of yachts. It's like buying tanks instead of paying the employees oftentimes.
Oh, wow.
So he would be like bragging like about the new tank he bought while he's delaying wages for, of course, not for no good reason, because obviously he has the money, he bought the tank. So he just prioritized him buying the tank over paying the employees. So now suddenly employers like this one, of which there are many in this region, are forced to actually pay the wages on time, and are forced to increase the wages from something that's been laughably small, like so small that it actually might be better to not work at all and just have any kind of welfare, would probably, which is a choice that like many people in Czech Republic would do. Oftentimes it would be people from the Roma community, because they have different culture. Like in their culture, striving to have jobs or like doing a career or working yourself to death essentially is not a priority. Like they're very family oriented culture, which is clashing with the sort of post-communist Czech culture very intensely, because the post-communist Czech culture is like, no, you need to work yourself to death. That's the important part. So it's like, if I like say it like, I'm careful to say it like this, because I'm trying to communicate. I'm not saying that like Roma people are lazy and that's a problem. I'm saying that, yeah, I'm actually with them on that one. It's like maybe the values, like it's more important to value family than to value like career over everything else. It's like actually would side with them culturally. It's that it's still a fact though that cultures are different. So in this case, that's one of the things, like if you have underpaid and overworked population, then that's, for instance, like increasing this tension. So if instead you enable everybody to have like a decently paid job, or like not for them to not be too difficult to make ends meet, then they're not going to be like angry as much at like a different subculture, in which is not just Roma people. Of course, there's like a subculture everywhere of people who just don't prioritize career, and maybe they're more artistically inclined. Or family oriented, like they would want to like care about family members, for instance, which is like one of these like unpaid jobs actually that is often not acknowledged. So there's different values. So there are always these people from this subculture, and there won't be tensions within like, for instance, places like the Czech Republic, if everybody who decides to do work like in the traditional career sense is able to make ends meet with the work that's not dehumanizing and that's just properly rewarded. Then it would make sense that it's fine. Like, I guess I don't have to, I definitely like the kind of person won't need to be jealous of a person who has money for apparently doing nothing, and that who doesn't have to go through this like insulting sort of because like really actually insulting jobs. So that's like one of the like why you need to like what can improve like in this way, just because the conditions of work are improving. It just sort of improves the whole mood in the society. So it's like one of the ways how it's immediately beneficial. And then just by it shows also that if it doesn't matter how terrible of a person the employer is, this is a way how the system can force even the worst people to do the right thing, if the incentives are in the system are set up correctly. Because that person is probably still a scumbag who would just rather, I don't know, buy tanks than pay people who work for him. But if literally nobody has to work for him, then they won't if he doesn't pay them. So he has to pay them. And then maybe buy one less tank, which will be probably very, very painful emotionally for that person, because that's what he cares about. And of course, it's a he. It's like all of them are the he's here. So if that's what he cares about. But that's how like you can use a system to make sure that even people who wouldn't want to do the right thing will do the right thing, and it will only be like painful to bad people. So that's not really a downside to it. And I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it in my region currently, just because one new big warehouse is being built in the city. So with a universal basic income, the effect of that would be much more intense.
Awesome. So I think we've kind of come full circle on some of the ups and downs with it, but I think it's pretty clear that the UBI, if it's done well and implemented well, and it's not too high, you have to make sure that it's still kind of low enough that there's still incentive to go and do something. We all can't be, rich people just kind of sitting around. We need some incentive to get out and do something valuable with our lives, but we'll have a lot more flexibility and choice with what we do and who we work for. The main challenge I see is a transition, trying to go from this society where we've all been forced to work for so long. It's been such a big part of our identity. We want to have jobs because it gives us an identity and a purpose, right? So we need to somehow transition from that need to work to a desire to have a purpose, to work because you want to, not because you have to. So if you can kind of just do a slowly gradual over 10, 20, 30 year transition from a very, very small teeny UBI to a slightly more to whatever the world can afford, I guess, and slowly raise the boat, the tide for everybody. Then it kind of gives people time to adjust. It gives those scumbag employers time to kind of get better and so they don't lose everybody all at once and go bankrupt right away. But it just helps kind of show that this is the direction we're going as a society. I don't see any other possible way to get there. It levels the playing field and makes it fair for everyone. Just about any problem you can imagine can be kind of solved in part by a well implemented UBI.
No, I definitely agree with this gradual implementation. I think that can go around many objections, because you can also scientifically analyze what sort of things it's doing as you're increasing it gradually. So that definitely makes sense. I would just say with the sort of transition, there are also events outside of everybody's control that can make it much faster, like the whole pandemic thing. Made a very quick shift in culture globally, in terms of people suddenly realizing, like, yeah, maybe the whole career thing is not as important, and maybe being with your loved ones and taking care of your family is. So in that sense, if people don't do it by of their own volition, it almost seems like the nature conspires to kick us in the ass to move in that direction faster. So I think the sort of world as such is really aligned with this whole idea and direction, if that makes sense right now. So definitely arguments for it are now much more easily made than they were before this year or last year.
Okay, great. So I think we're pretty well in agreement that this is the path forward. We just have to somehow convince these last few holdouts that just are convinced that if we have a UBI, it'll crash the whole world economy. Everyone will stop working. Everyone will be lazy bums on, Netflix and alcohol and whatever. We have to somehow convince those last few people that it is a good idea and that we can actually trust ourselves to not become too addicted and lazy, and that we'll still actually want to do something with our lives, even though we don't necessarily have to anymore.
I think of all the counter arguments, the one about people just being then lazy and not doing anything, I don't think that's very valid counter argument, because there are some people who under every circumstance or system, as long as they even marginally are able, they would just don't do anything. But those are the people who, even if they are technically working, they're not doing great work. So the productivity just isn't coming from those people. So you have to just sort of mature, I think, as humanity, and realize that you should just stop forcing people who never will want to work. Just leave them alone. It's just okay, it's fine. There'll be some people who just that way. Fine, let them live. Let just be fine, and realize that vast majority of people will, of their own volition, just want to be productive and have a career and do something, have an effect. And so I think this will have to be borne out in the numbers if you start implementing it within conditions, like unless there's like sort of like external factors that are sort of interfering with it. But that would only happen if you have like a small, very localized test trial. Like in a localized test trial in a small sample, any kind of thing can happen, because like, but depending on how you select the sample, you can have various interferences with the general effect. But like, if you really were to universally apply it in any sort of large territory, I think it would have to show that most people who just still want to do something, it would just improve the conditions. What I think would be the actual fair price for the job. So I think would like sort of just again show in this sort of market equation, would forcefully show what the real price of a particular type of labor is. Because it would be like, if people don't have to do it, then the amount of money for which they will do it shows what's the actual amount of money that should be paid for it within the market. So I think that's just like much like with the carbon tax, it's just factoring in what the actual costs are. So that way I don't think it's anti-economical or anti-free market or anything. It's like for more genuine free market. It's just I think the potentially valid counter arguments against universal basic income is, one is economical, one political. The economical one I don't think I can solve, because I'm not really, my brain is not an economist brain. So I don't know the exact effects of like, okay, so if you give money to everybody else, if you won't just increase the prices and therefore negate the value of the money and drive hyperinflation, I don't know. That's something that has to be tested, I think, scientifically to be determined. I don't accept anybody's arguments now what it will definitely be, because you can't know it until you test it. So I think this is a question for objective testing, and my hunch is that it will be fine, mostly, if the amount of money that's given to everybody is reasonable. I think the most valid counter-argument that could be potentially the most problematic, and I'm not entirely sure what to do to avoid in implementation, to avoid the problem. It's like I mentioned before, is the political issue of people becoming wards of the state, whether it's a particular national state or some sort of nebulous one world government, if it then becomes a global initiative. And I'm not 100% sure what will happen in this area, because I think this sort of depends on how, by whom it is implemented exactly. I think we should be wary of that. So if somebody was trying to twist it in that direction so that people would oppose it.